MultiGreen, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the MultiGreen podcast. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Executive Director of the ULI Terwilliger Center for Housing, Christopher Ptomey. Prior to joining ULI, Christopher helped launch and lead Habitat for Humanity International's U.S. government relations and advocacy team, and he did that for over a decade. He also served as a federal liaison for the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs and as a senior legislative aide to Representative Michael Collins. He brings a lot to the table with his expertise surrounding attainable housing. Enjoy our conversation. Christopher Ptomey, thank you for being with us today on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Randy.
Today, we're going to talk about attainability. Can you mention to the listeners what ULI does for home attainability?
Absolutely. And home attainability is a top priority for us at the Urban Land Institute, and particularly at the Terwilliger Center for Housing. And when we talk about home attainability, what we really mean is the effectiveness of a region's housing market to provide options to people at all income levels in terms of their housing. Most of our work at ULI prioritizes market rate housing options because that's where most of us live in housing that the markets provide. And if we're ever going to meet the challenges that we have in the country around housing, it's going to be by enabling markets to reach deeper income levels. We're never going to have enough public subsidy to serve all those needs. So we really try to prioritize those market rate solutions and extending the reach of markets in order for families and households to have options for their housing that they can afford.
So there's a term in the industry of affordability and attainability. Can you help us differentiate between the two?
Absolutely. And to some degree, we use them interchangeably, but we prefer the term attainability at ULI because the term affordable housing in particular is an empty term, but it creates lots of false assumptions and it kind of conjures images in people's minds that aren't necessarily accurate in terms of what we're talking about. So a lot of times, if you say affordable housing, people will think about urban slums of 50 years ago. And whereas what is being produced today that's often called affordable housing, which is publicly subsidized income restricted housing, is really indistinguishable from market rate housing. If you were standing at the curb, you couldn't tell the difference between the market rate units and the subsidized units. And actually on the interior of the units, often you couldn't tell that it's not a market rate unit. We think it's better not to conjure those images. And I think more broadly, the reality is affordability is not just a challenge for low-income households anymore. Being able to fit housing into one's budget is reaching higher and higher up the income spectrum. And so I think it's important to talk about attainability more broadly and talk about what households across income levels can afford. But again, we use the term somewhat interchangeably, but I think using the word attainability helps signal kind of both the broader challenge that we face and the fact that it's not a solution from 50 years ago that's being provided today.
I like the ULI messaging here, and the fact that this is actually being defined is very helpful for property owners and developers like MultiGreen. We are specifically focusing on attainability, and this is what we're all talking about this season. Season 1 is attainability. But how did housing prices become so unattainable and or unaffordable in many of the parts of the United States today?
Well, it didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. This has happened over a long period of time. I think big picture, it's been a combination of slow income growth and housing production shortfalls. And particularly, we've seen these shortfalls happen in the higher cost, faster growing markets. I think other contributors have been the failure to extend affordability periods or to replace low-cost units whose affordability periods are expiring. And I think we've also had an increasing loss of naturally occurring affordable housing. And we've lost it both to obsolescence in some cases, as well as to upgrading and redevelopment in other cases. And finally, I'd point to kind of a barbell housing production pattern that we've seen, where you've seen production at the very low income end because it's subsidized and you have low income housing tax credits and other production programs to support that. But then you don't see a lot of production that's really designed to meet middle income needs. You see production at the other end, at the luxury end. And I think what that's left us with is people who are stuck on both sides of that market. So on top of the lack of production, you have folks who could afford to move into better housing if it were available, who are taking up housing that lower income households have a great need for. On the other end of the spectrum, you have folks who are living in luxury housing, or maybe they live in a home and are ready to downsize, but they don't have an appropriate unit to downsize to. And if they could simply go back to some of that missing middle housing, you would make that ownership unit available maybe to some of the millennials who are coming up and having a hard time finding own units right now. So I think in addition to having insufficient production over time, we've also created disconnected markets where people don't have the opportunity to alter their housing over time to reflect their changing needs.
I want to have two follow-up questions on this. Does NIMBYism, can you talk about this and how that plays a role? And also I want to talk a little bit more granular about housing stock and potentially the aging or the vintage or the units that become out of compliance. I know that we always define area median income, but do we ever really get into the distribution curve of what housing units are available and what type of units are available? So if you could address both of those, I think there's also a lot of problems around that.
Absolutely. I think the question of NIMBYism really is maybe the number one barrier to solving the housing challenges that we face today. And I think we have to be careful not to overgeneralize because opposition to housing development, it comes from different places. So sometimes it comes from a place of misunderstanding the actual economics of the equation. So sometimes people don't understand that if they could place more units on the property that they own, that property value actually goes up. It may have an impact on what the neighborhood looks like at the end of the day. And there may be other values that are impacted by that. But from an economic value standpoint, most of the time, housing development is supporting property values. And so that's often misunderstood and is often a basis of NIMBYism. But there's also NIMBYism that comes from other places. And I think it's important to remember the impact that redlining and other discriminatory practices have had over time. And communities that have been underinvested and populations that have not participated in housing investment over time rightfully question when development is happening, whether or not they'll be able to benefit from that. And so I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a failure to fully engage the public about what housing needs are and what housing development realities are and what kind of trade-offs you have to make in order for us to have the kinds of cities, the kinds of communities that we want to live in. Because people do essentially want to protect themselves and they want to protect their families and look out for their best interests. And so I think it comes from a very honest place and a very authentic place for folks. And what we need to do is help educate on realities and then help kind of put guardrails in place so that we're ensuring that the benefits of development are fully reaching the communities that we're trying to serve and the housing needs that we're trying to meet. With regard to the question of some of the properties that are moving into obsolescence, I think it's a very good point that we need to be doing deeper dives into what does the housing stock that's available look like? What's its quality? Who needs to be served and what needs to be done to meet those needs? We've been able to actually participate in some studies along those lines at the Terwilliger Center. So last year, we were able to partner with the city of Philadelphia and ULI Philadelphia to look at some of their naturally occurring affordable housing stock that remains. Some of it remains at great risk of either falling into obsolescence or being redeveloped and targeted toward higher income levels when they have expectations of growing attainability problems, housing attainability problems in Philadelphia. And so working with the city, we were able to go in, bring some expertise to the table, do a deep dive, look at who owns the properties, what is the quality of the housing that exists, how much need is there for investment and protection of those properties to ensure that the growing need can be met, and frankly, where are those properties that do need to be redeveloped and in order for them to continue to be of good service and to help meet the needs that the city is facing. So I think doing deep dives and really understanding what stock exists, where do you need redevelopment or new development, where can you protect what's existing and serve populations. Obviously, that's often a less expensive way to meet needs. But you don't want to do it if you're not meeting very basic quality requirements. So I think those are very important things to understand as cities consider their plans of addressing their housing needs.
In addition to ULI, are you aware of any publicly available resources that do those deep dives in the housing stock per MSA?
Broadly, well, I guess I would frame it this way: ULI leverages a number of other organizations' work in our work, and so the National Housing Conference, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, if you're talking about the lower end of the spectrum, do deeper and more granular dives on what's available at the income band that they focus on. At some of the industry groups representing builders or realtors, they often look at kind of average income versus average home price and look at some of that availability. So there are a variety of those indexes out there that are looking at particular pieces of this. I'm not aware of other resources like ULI's that are actually trying to bring it together and look across different kinds of product types, income levels, and both rental and ownership. I'm sure that there are some of those out there, but I think most of the tools tend to look at more narrowly targeted focus areas.
That's very good feedback. The reason why I ask is you mentioned this dumbbell effect with housing supply, and there's this missing middle. We've heard figures from a housing shortage of 1.7 million units to 4.6 million units to 6.8 million units. And I think all of us have a hard time understanding or interpreting what those facts and figures are. So my question to you is, do we have a housing shortage? And what is that figure?
I don't know the figure, but I know we have a housing shortage. And the way that I know that we have a housing shortage is that it doesn't matter where you are in the country. You have affordability or attainability challenges. And admittedly, it's not all on the housing side. It's a mismatch between income and housing that's available. But we have historically had markets that have done a better job in serving their local housing needs than we're seeing today. And I think, if we saw more variety and we saw a lot of places in the country where housing was really attainable and you had the options, families had the options that they were looking for. If you wanted to move into ownership, you could do so. If you wanted to move back into a smaller unit as you age, those options would be available to you. And you just don't see that many cities where that's the case. And I think you see more and more, particularly in the news, you see all kinds of articles about different ways that markets are supposedly being warped, whether it's by investors coming in, whether they be domestic investors, foreign investors, but anyone coming into a market, any investment coming into a market is often criticized as creating, greater competition or driving higher costs, when actually that's just a reflection of a lack of supply. It doesn't help you to buy up those units and try to drive the cost up if there's plenty of supply and people have options. I think that you do hear voices out there from time to time that say that there's plenty of housing out there. I think when you have rapidly appreciating for sale home prices, which we have seen certainly over the last couple of years, but if you look at the last year, even more rapidly appreciating rents, I think that's a clear indicator that we have a substantial housing shortage. And I think it's going to continue to grow. And I think once you get into the detail of what kind of units are needed and where they're needed, it's even worse than it looks. We need more family-sized units at the end of the day that have not been developed. And we need more units in those locations where there's the greatest demand and frankly, where the costs are the highest and it's harder to get the units on the ground. So there's no question in my mind that we have a housing shortage, whether it's 3 million or 7 million units. I don't know. But what I know is that we're a long way from delivering the units that people are seeking.
Mm-hmm. And from a renter's preference or an ownership preference, the newer homes, the newer units, the ones that are less functionally obsolescent are always going to seek higher market rents. So this bottom half of the supply, we really need to understand and, in my opinion, figure out how to upgrade and up-level and refurbish many of the units that are available to us even today. Many of these units are in unlivable conditions.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And I think that's a great opportunity. And particularly when you consider the long timelines it takes to put a new unit on the ground and put that aside, the astounding amount of need that we see today, leaving those unoccupiable units out there on the ground is just unacceptable at the end of the day. If we're going to take this challenge seriously, if we're going to do what we need to do, not just for our families and our households to be successful, but for our cities to be successful, we need to leverage those units that are on the ground, and we need to add stock to make sure that we're not just trying to catch up with yesterday's needs, but that we're putting the stock in place to meet tomorrow's needs as well.
You just put the finger on it. I want to find a study that has, either by city or by the entire country, what is our unoccupied or functionally obsolete units that are unlivable. And that shortfall is going to be a huge number that incorporates into this housing stock shortage. I want to ask you, what can cities do? There's a bunch of stakeholders that are out there. I can at least think of 5. There's the investors, there's the lenders, there are the cities and municipalities, there are companies, and there are residents, at least when we're talking about attainable and for rent or for ownership properties. But it seems like these cities have a lot of say and influence. Let's focus on that for a second. What do cities need to do to address these challenges?
Well, I think first of all, they have to take them seriously, and you have to talk about them publicly. You have to engage the public in a serious way and provide them the information that they need over enough time so that it can be absorbed and it can be taken seriously, and that you can put a plan together that meets the needs of the future. I think while it was only a first step, I think what they did in Minneapolis around zoning is a great example, because they really went out. They had over 200 public meetings, and not just kind of meeting in the school gym in a kind of typical public meeting kind of fashion. They really actively went out and found people where they were and had real conversations, and were able to build support for the changes that they needed over time. And so it was by them taking it seriously, by them taking their constituencies seriously enough to give them the information that they needed, so that when it came the time to make the decision, the public officials could act in the way that they knew that was right, and they knew that they would have enough support amongst their constituencies to go forward with that. So I think first and foremost, cities just need to take this seriously, to realize it's their job to plan what kind of housing development happens within their city limits, and then to engage whom they need to engage to make that happen. And that really goes across the different stakeholder groups that you mentioned. You got to have this financed. You have to have it developed at the end of the day. You certainly need broad community engagement to make sure that what it is you're developing is what you actually need and what people want, and what's going to serve the needs of your community at the end of the day. And I think then what cities can do is reflect the realities of development. And that means reducing costs of development for housing where they can. There are a lot of ways to do that. I think leveraging publicly controlled land is a great way to do it. Certainly adding density is a great solution that cities have found. And there are all kinds of ways to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean a high-rise building. You have much lower density models out there today where you could add substantial numbers of units in formerly single-family detached neighborhoods. So looking at density is an opportunity. Looking at regulations that may be outdated. Parking regulations in particular drive enormous amounts of cost, $100,000 per parking spot or more in cities like Washington, D.C. And so finding ways to reduce those parking requirements to reflect modern realities. Not as many people are staying in their cars. There are other options for people today. Changing zoning requirements, and then also passing kind of other enabling legislation so that once you change zoning, you can actually have development follow that meets the need. So they found out in Minneapolis, you have to change lot size and setbacks and some of those other kinds of requirements in addition to changing the basic zoning in order to add units on the ground. And then I think the other really important piece that cities can take care of is taking a good look at their entitlement processes. When you have a lot of danger around cost, when you have a lot of risk around inflation, it's all the more important that your entitlement processes are short and reliable. And so enabling developers to have their projects approved or rejected in a relatively short period of time and know that they can move forward with the project at that point is a really important way that cities can limit cost and enable development. And developers will flock to cities that get their entitlement processes together. They want to see when they see those processes that they can rely on, when they know how long it's going to take to get approved, and they know they can move forward at that point without having to relitigate it constantly. I think that you get a lot of developer interest and you get a lot of strong production on the housing side. So I think it starts with planning, but then it comes to actually enabling that planning to come to fruition by helping projects pencil out. And that means reducing costs through policy in whatever way that you can.
There's one stakeholder group that I forgot to mention, and that is industry participants and thought leaders like ULI. What is ULI doing to help?
Well, thanks for that question, Randy. We are doing deep dives in communities, not just in the US, but around the world around housing needs. And I should mention, the next 3 years, housing is a global mission priority for the Urban Land Institute. So in addition to a lot of the work that we're doing in the US, we have some amazing research that's happening in the EU. In the Asia Pacific region, we are creating a new housing center, and they're going to replicate our US Home Attainability Index with a Asia Pacific Home Attainability Index that's looking at 6 or 7 countries and multiple cities within those countries. And so we're looking globally at what the need is and trying to put the information in stakeholders' hands that they need to be successful in making the arguments to move housing forward. In the US, a lot of the work that we're doing is direct engagement with cities and with local stakeholders. And so over the next 2 years, we're going to be doing study panels in at least 10 cities. And we'll be going in with anywhere from 5 to 10 local stakeholders and national housing experts to look at specific housing questions and to develop a set of recommendations. And then for up to a year, the Terwilliger Center will continue to support the local ULI district council and the local jurisdiction as they seek to follow up on those recommendations and implement housing solutions in those communities. But as these study panels are brought together to address a specific question, which might be, what do we do with this census tract or this neighborhood that we have an opportunity to preserve some housing and redevelop some property for housing? What does that plan look like? We want to come in and help answer that question, but we also want to bring the city enough information that in that process, they understand directionally what they need to do to meet the city's broader challenges. And then as kind of a final concentric circle of impact, we're gonna put all of those recommendations and outcomes up on a new housing development resource hub that we're creating at ULI, so that you can see the work that's being done in cities nationally, so that cities can learn from the lessons, the recommendations that have been made elsewhere, and then the lessons learned as those recommendations are pursued. So again, hopefully each of these engagements won't just create that solution for that neighborhood, but will point the city in the right direction and provide information that's useful to other cities as well. So that's a big way that we're doing it. One other thing that I would mention quickly is our district council housing exchange. We have about 50 district councils around the country. They're working in more than 100 jurisdictions throughout the US. And many of these district councils have local housing task forces, committees, product councils, some sort of local housing stakeholder group that's working to advance the ball in meeting housing needs locally. And so we've created a new district council housing exchange, which is a group of these local stakeholders that are more highly engaged. We've enabled them to communicate on a real-time basis, share what they're learning, ask each other for solutions to the challenges and the barriers that they're finding locally on an ongoing basis. And then every couple of months, we're going to bring them together along with a group of housing experts and a curated group of ULI members with particular expertise around the projects that are happening locally for these district councils, and can help give them feedback on their work and help provide them direction for their future plans. And so we hope that we're going to enable, and we have 14 district councils that are involved so far, which is great, 14 of our 50, which is very exciting. And so we hope that by having them better connected, by providing a more complete set of national expertise, applying a more complete set of national expertise to the challenges that they're facing locally, we can really start moving the needle, put more housing on the ground, and meet the needs that we're seeing emerge locally.
Excellent. I have one final question for you today. What does attainability mean to you? How would you define it, Christopher?
At the end of the day, when it comes to home attainability, which is what's most important to me in my work, what home attainability means is the ability to pursue my household's success more broadly because I have adequate housing that doesn't cost me too much. It's housing that connects me. It's housing that meets my needs and the needs of my family and enables me to make the other investments that I need in order for my household to be successful.
Christopher Ptomey with the ULI Terwilliger Center for Housing. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Randy. I really appreciate the time. It was a great opportunity to talk about our work, so thank you. And thank you so much for MultiGreen's support of our work at the Terwilliger Center and our Housing Opportunity Conference. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think MultiGreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.